Thank you for coming this time on Saturday morning. I just wanted to start by welcoming some of you to Art as Politics, Art as Resistance, and others of you to Art as Agency, Art as Counter-Narrative, depending on what you said about this. We will try and address all of you. Let's just start by introducing ourselves. We'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves, actually, but we have Romani Pereira, Kumar and Anthony Hockey. Romani, if you would start by just introducing yourself.
Primarily I think I come to this space as a performer. I work in a theatre context, but I've been working in the Art Biennale as the curator of the live art segment, and perhaps some of the work that I choose to discuss later on in the session will speak for some of the choices I make, I think. So, let's move to that.
Come on.
I'm Kumari. I'm not creative in English. So,
in fact, we were going to say this. We will speak today in whichever language we prefer and maybe a mixture of languages. And we'll do a half job in translation in that we'll translate everything into English.
but the thing is actually why I said that I'm writing sometimes. But I take myself as Asian woman. So, so then the writings come based on that and through that. So I don't want to say I'm a writer because I don't take the responsibility of writing my whole life. And if it happens, I let it happen. So you may not be reading what I write because it's easy. Sorry for that. But I think I will try to explain what is written to me.
Hello, my name is Anthony Hockey. I'll describe my practice a little bit. It's really certainly two strands. Primarily an artist, socially engaged artist, and that really comes from where I live. I live on the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland has been through a 30-year conflict. And of course, we're all conditioned by the worlds we inhabit. So for me, my art practice is always reflected in an immersive way in the everyday, and the kind of experiences I live in, and the kind of social situations that I observe. So that's one thing that becomes a practice. And I'm also an academic, I'm also a researcher, and I work in a research centre where primarily I'm supervising practice-based PhD projects.
And I'm Gallappatti. It seems increasingly a professional moderator, but I come to this with a background in creating documentary pieces in the theatre. So I'm just going to start actually by reading out to you, even though you have it here, the question that was posed to us on whichever title you want to take. It is, in contexts where democracies have robbed people of a sense of urgency, art has been used time and again as a means of political expression. The panel thus discusses the notion of creative agency in the context of the possibility to empower, the freedom to express, and the embodying of resistance. As we enter as a society an era of transitional justice discourse, the panel will consider how art becomes significant because of its capacity to reposition the individual as agent in narrative, in memory, in history. So in considering how to reframe this question to the panel, I read it many times, and gradually it seemed to me that it was less of a question and more of a hopeful plea. At best that art might save the day, and at worst that bad governments might at least produce good art. And in the question about individual agency also, I wondered if there was a little bit of loss of faith in the collective. And overall, it seemed less a question and more a call to arms, so we will do our best. I think we are all on this panel working in contexts where we find it difficult to make grand claims in the abstract. And so we will try today to speak in specifics and to speak about specific works that are to us acts of artistic resistance, and to talk about why they're meaningful to us in the context of this proposition. So we're going to divide this session into two halves, basically. In the first half, the panelists will speak about works made by other people, and the second half about their own practice. And hopefully, both we and you can respond to questions raised in the process. So each of the panelists is here now with an example of an artistic act or process that they would like to speak about. And I would like you to present them to us and maybe tell us why they are meaningful to you as acts of resistance. If I could... if I could start with Romani.
I don't have an image today of what I'm going to talk about, but I'm trying to connect something that came up in the last discussion because it's been interesting for me to ensure that there's a thread that connects all of the conversations that we've had. So I'd like to present to you the piece titled The Broken Palmyra. That was a performance art piece that was done by Dr. Constantine. Dr. Constantine was based in the University of Jaffna, and in the 1980s he talks of a surge or an interest in performance art practice. And as a performance artist, he was responding to the text of The Broken Palmyra. The authors of which were Rajni Pirandama, Daya Somasundaram, Raju Pool, and K. Sridharan. The Broken Palmyra looked at a very specific narrative of the context of Jaffna, bringing into discussion some of the ideas of history, of memory, of narrative, and actually playing with all of these ideas. We know of Rajni Pirandama's death. And what Dr. Constantine did was, in 1998 in the Gallappatti Gallery, he painted a work that was resonant with some of the thoughts in the Broken Palmyra, and also resonant with the politics of the Broken Palmyra in the context of shaping narrative. And as everyone watched, he set fire to the artwork itself. The piece is interesting just because of the destruction, the element of destruction. And I think for all of us, in these contexts, and perhaps, I don't know if it was a call when I framed this, but I am interested, and especially after your talk yesterday, we also came very close to that in this context where political agency is denied consistently, continuously in societies. I wonder if there is such a thing as creative agency. And when an artist stands up there and burns something of his work, for me there's an active resistance which somehow I respond to. And it became interesting for me to bring it over from the previous discussion into this one because of the politics in general.
Can I just ask you to elaborate more on what it is resisting?
Well, first he talked about the fact that it's a creation. As an artist, for him it was a creation. And to set fire to it was almost like to end something that you started shaping. And for me that's again interesting because we are consistently trying to shape something. And in any narrative, we try to break the binary opposition of narratives so that there is a range of voices that speak. And as I listen to him talk about burning that word, it is also to remind us something of the possibility of not being able to exist. And that is what was going.
I think you probably understand that. I was just wondering if you would actually articulate it, which you just have. Okay. Thank you. Should we move on to Kumari?
Actually, he's my first love I'm talking about, and which all of you know very well, and he's belonged to the past, present and future, He's Jesus Christ. I think I'm not talking about the Jesus, the Son of the God. I'm talking about the Jesus of Galilee, Nazareth, who was a craftsman in a fishing village. And I take the artwork, I take as his art of living and art of dying. Because the best piece for me of his is that in the cross, he said, I love to say it in Sinhala, oh, Nodana Karna Varana to Samavan. He was not hating the ones who was torturing him, but he said that please be forgiven because they don't know what they are doing. And his whole life, he was living against the history which was being lived at the time. I mean, institutionalized systems. He was against the power. He was against the authority. But what he was against, again, used him to for their existence. Like we know that Vatican or Christian institutions all use him as the God. But I'm talking about Jesus, who was a son, who was a friend, who was a husband, who was a father. And so his work, I think we all love his work, but we have been given from a different angle. So that inspired me for my life and for my work.
Okay, I'm going to discuss a work by the artist Santiago Sierra. The reason I'm doing this is it's oppositional to the work that I do, but I think, and it's a complex work. I think it's important for a number of reasons. So what's represented here is an installation photograph from a gallery show in Berlin. So we first encounter as we walk into the space these cardboard boxes. Could be like minimalist art, I'm not quite sure what's happening here. And it's slowly revealed. Next slide. The audience is engaging with the work, not quite sure. Maybe some noises coming from this box and so on. Okay, next slide. Actually, what the work is about, Sierra pays people, often marginalized people, often people who live on the edge of society, homeless people, refugees, people who can't afford to live. And he pays them a minimum wage, which reflects capitalist society, and he pays them to do really dreadful things. And in this case, he pays this group of refugees in Berlin to sit inside cardboard boxes throughout the minimum wage for the period that the exhibition is installed. So what I'm interested in is when we enter the white cube, the gallery space, it's ostensibly maybe a middle class audience, and I find sometimes that the art world is very polite. Okay? There are certain things we don't say. There are certain things that we don't reflect back. And I think what this provocation does, it asks us to confront something that's in our lives every day. The idea that people are exploited. It's an exploitative system. So he mirrors that system in his work, and he shows it back to us. We can argue about the ethics of this, but I think as a provocation, it's a really interesting idea.
Thank you.
About the ethics of this kind of work, it remains a question for me. and then I felt the need to bring the idea of resistance, because you belong to company agency, I said come to archive, because I feel like when you call the archive into question in the counter, you always sort of also engage the archive, and when you're doing that kind of work, there is an ending. And I keep asking that question myself, and I don't yet know what we're doing when we work with the streets. When we bring people into art as bodies, as lives, with their individual histories, I ask that question of my own work. And I think you can share something.
Yeah, I think I put this work up here, as you'll see, and I'm showing my own work, it's completely oppositional to this. But nonetheless, this question of ethics, and the question of what art remains a representation, it's not, it can be human bodies, it can be objects. The real question is what is brought into representation at a particular moment, and how is that representation meeting the audience, and how is that mediated or not mediated. The question of ethics is a really important one, but then we can argue in a late capitalist society, there is no ethics. It's an exploitative world. Whether this particular example mirrors that particular position, we could argue, and I'm doing my own work here, we could also argue in the kind of work that I do that art is useless. I'm going to throw that question out there. Can art change the world? It's doubtful. Sierra argues that it can't change anything. So he's using this. He doesn't make these claims, by the way. He doesn't make claims that at all. It becomes something quite different. In many of his works, authorities actually close his exhibitions down because of these questions of ethics. I think this question will come up again in much clearer way as well.
I would like Mari also to respond to the question of working with other people's lived experience.
Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, when you talk about ethics, who defines it and whose ethics you are talking about? For me, everything is defined or designed or the concept was brought by the power. So for me, I'm always representing, I don't like to say powerless, but it is power, but it is not recognized or it is not having a space, which is not heard. Somebody can say that you are going there as a superior body to represent them. Which in my case, I go as useless being. So what I realized throughout my life, because my artwork, I think my life, it happens through my life.
Mari, maybe describe a little bit of what you're doing when you're making this work also.
I think I'm living because I like to be happy and I know others to be happy. But I just can't be happy inside my house under the mosquito net because I know very well there are so many which don't have that facility and which we have taken those facilities from them. So I know all of us are responsible. So because of that, somebody can ask, so which place you recognize, which people, which group of people you recognize? I say which is close to me. Mostly women, children, and mostly the Tamil-speaking people in my country. Because I think we are more responsible, that's my understanding, we are more responsible of them than the people in India or people in Afghanistan or people in Palestine. We are responsible of all human kind, not only that, all beings in the world. I think, because for me, when we are talking about human rights, I wonder, are we in the center? Are we the most vicious kind? What about the other beings? So I like to take it as holistic thing, but when my work regarding my work, it's happening with the people in North and East. So yeah, so somebody can ask, you are writing about their pain, so you are selling their pain, or you are glorifying the pain, or especially because of my second book was like coffee table book. It's a lot of artwork and full color, totally, and expensive compared to many Sri Lankan Sinhala poetry books. But I said yes, I'm selling it to the people who can afford it. But I know that I'm not making use of their pain. People can see it in different ways and read as they wish.
Interesting question that we raised about ethics, and in a sense, I struggle with this also in my work, and I don't have a thorough ideological answer to it, but I do have a practical test that I set myself, which is to ask if there's a gap between the people whose lives are in the work and the people who are doing the work. And if the larger the gap, the more uncomfortable I am.
I think this raises a really important question as well. Perhaps you mentioned it earlier. You raised this question really well. What we're really talking about is power relations. And power relations exist in every relationship, between partners, between brother and sister, between institutions. And I think through art sometimes, not by blaming anything in particular, coming back to this idea that we may or may not get towards climate change, but I think we can actually challenge power relations. We can show how power relations work by performing acts sometimes, performing acts that challenge the status quo. This is called democracy, and we can make it work in a type of space that changes that relationship. For example, I'll say maybe very quickly a work I made called How to Be a Model Citizen, where I've worked with the same group of people claiming asylum, trying to claim various forms of citizenship for the last 10 years. And we made this work called How to Be a Model Citizen, which is basically an architectural intervention, like a waiting room. And then together we developed a citizenship test. And the citizenship test wasn't for migrants, it's for the indigenous people. So the asylum seekers became the administrators, the gatekeepers, the border controllers. And it's a very subtle piece, but something changes in our performance. And I think doing that in a democratic space is absolutely gallery. It really points up to how those power relations are actually working.
Would you like to elaborate?
What I also find very interesting is then in that contest, where the anxieties lie, and who defines those anxieties. Just because in relation to your poetry, I remember talking about Kumari's work at a dinner table where a lot of interesting things in Sri Lanka take place. And trying to convince another writer at the table of the significance of the work, or what is interesting about the work. And what is interesting is the contest and the working with that space of power. But then the idea is that what is it for a Sinhala woman to write a Tamil woman's story is one of the questions that's asked. And the privilege of a particular segment of society that can go into that society and walk away, leaving someone else to live with that experience. And I'm always interested with these anxieties because they sort of sometimes detract from the thing that is happening itself, what you talked about earlier.
And in a way it brings us back to the overall question in this, the question, the proposition about resistance. I wonder if sometimes in framing it as resistance, we are calling into being a conflict that in some senses Kumari is saying she's working with what she wants to work with, she's working with people she wants to work with, rather than it being an act of resistance as such. Would you like to say more about that? Whether the question of resistance is muddying the work in some senses in this context.
I just like to share one of my experience because I was not visiting my sisters and brothers in North and East for the sake of fighting. So the writing just happened, and so because as I said, I take my work as again art of living. I like to say that the living is my work. So writing can happen, shouting can happen, as I was like reciting poetry at Berlin's work. So it can be anything. And I remember the after tsunami when I was in Gallappatti, we were doing actually. I was alone. I was on my own. I was cycling. I was walking. I was just getting into any vehicle possible, like meeting people and writing to people abroad that we need support. So whatever you send, that will go to the people. So I was there like for 2 years continuously. At one point when I was sitting in a thatched roof temporary shelter somewhere in Gallappatti, a man came to me and said, introduced him as he lost his wife and child. So I could manage some Tamil by that time. So I was asking him, so how you are existing, how you are doing, what can I do for you, how is your other child? Then after a while he asked, Akka, Ninga Nalla Al, Ninga Nalla you are okay, he said. So I said, why? Then he said, you know, we wanted to know who you are. So we went to the places where you were living, staying, and we asked who you are. And they said, you are Kumari Akka. So what else? And they said, they don't know. So I said, to tell you the truth, even I don't know. And then he said, that was the problem. Actually, when I went and said my leader, he said, so it's like, you know, I was in trouble, mostly for LTT at that time. Because I'm a Sinhalese, I'm a woman, and I was alone. I didn't have a vehicle, I didn't have a flag, I didn't have money, I didn't have anything. So how come, like, you know, so the resistance for me is going against the accepted system. I mean, I said, I can't help it. I'm afraid of death. I don't want to die. So what do you think, what I must do? He said, no, now everything okay. I will go and tell them. I said, but still, I'm afraid, you know. I don't want to die. And then another friend later came to me and said, let's go and meet LTT leaders at the area. I said, no. I did not take permission from the government side, and I don't take permission from this side. But if you think I'm in danger, I will go back home. And if you think it is good for me to be there, you go and settle the problem and let me know. So, I mean, the problem is actually how we are ready to break those systematic, accepted ways, even in our work. So somebody can say, you are having, yeah, of course, I have the advantage, I have the luxury of sitting here inside the Goethe Institute and speaking about this, which my subjects don't get. You know, the women whom I talk about, they can't. But I go to them, believe me. So I'm not just being somewhere else. I go with them, I cry with them, I sit with them, I eat what they eat. So that is my art.
I think we've moved into the second half, and Romani, perhaps you would like to speak about your own work. That's quite tough.
Which is that I'm not exactly going to talk about one of my own work, but I will address one of the work that I curated for the Art Biennale, which was placed here at the last conversation. What you see up there is Janani Kure in her performance art piece, Pasting the Pieces. And Janani is here, I think, if anyone has questions of her work later on. Pasting the Pieces was first performed in 2004 at the University of Jaffna during the residency that was titled Ahampura. Johnny worked with a dummy that was completely black, and she sat in different spaces of the University of Jaffna, at the public library, in different spaces, going into canteens or going into the garden, and just sitting around people, pasting. What she was pasting were pieces of fabric that we recognize, from dresses, from sarongs, from cheetah, from someone's shirt or someone's frock. And that was all she kept doing. That was the duration of the piece. And until sometimes someone stopped and asked her what was going on. She sometimes replied, or sometimes she was so much invested in the work just kept going on. Until the blackened body is covered with all the pieces of fabric. The next, for me, significant reprising of the piece is at a conference, War and Peace Visual Narratives from South Asia, where she did it again. But she brought in her legs. By then, the time had changed. This was 2013. We had something of a piece. And so over the pieces of colorful fabric, she pasted primary colors: red, blue, green, and yellow also? Yeah, red, blue, and green, primary colors. And everyone sat around watching the primary colors. For her, they were representative of a different moment of our politics and political parties. And then for me, it was interesting for me to bring in this work back into discussion here. We worked for a long time with what the next journey was for this piece. And it is always interesting for me that she keeps returning to the first layer of the fabric that she pasted first at Ahampura, and then the second time of the primary colors. And the third time when she did it, she actually had emerging black squares, bringing something of that body, making something of that body evident again, charred black body. And instead of talking about something that was my own, what I did want to bring into discussion was why I felt it interesting and significant and relevant to bring it into the context of making history. For me, Janani is a woman artist. She's a performance artist. And there is a politics of engagement, which I find interesting. And when we talk of the word resistance, when Janani walks into any of these spaces, she doesn't call it resistance. It's not an act of resistance. It's just the act of walking into space and pasting, meditatively, while being witnessed sometimes, while not being witnessed sometimes. And even though it doesn't set out to be an act of resistance, I think it's interesting work to bring into discussion.
Where I live, in Ireland, in the last 15 years or so, Ireland's been through this boom and bust economy. During the very good times, Ireland's been a relatively poor country in a way, by Western standards in Europe. And then coming out of the 80s into the 90s, kind of struck gold and everybody went crazy. Big parties. But as a wealthy country, it started to attract migrants, many illegal migrants from all over the world. And I talked about this earlier, being immersed in the everyday. This was something, a phenomenon that started to rise in Ireland about how people were negotiating citizenship in various forms, or even leave to remain as an asylum seeker and refugee. So here's the background. Ireland shifted from a largely monoculture, 99% white, mostly Catholic, and in the space of a very short time, 12 years maybe, it's now shifted to something like 12% non-Irish, speaking about over 100 languages now. That's phenomenal in such a short space of time. You know, as an artist, a really exciting time. I started to work slowly with a group of people who were claiming asylum, and we made a lot of projects together now over a period of 10 years. We rarely use the word asylum seeker or refugee because it's been captured by the media in a very negative way. So this collective, this group of people, we came up with a name for a collective as a global migration research network. So it means that meeting points when we meet audiences, there's a little bit of grayness, confusion about how people are being met. The danger of using the opposite, this is a group of asylum seekers and an artist, becomes incredibly reductive. Naming is an incredibly political thing. So that's one part. So there's a whole series of projects that are made. I'm just going to discuss this one. It is around narrative, it is around resistance, and it's certainly about agency. So what happens when you leave the security of citizenship and you enter a country with no rights, no way to speak out, no way to express yourself creatively? In this project, it started with a conversation with the film crew, myself, and a group of about 12 migrants from Dublin and Belfast. So I'm also playing with the border within Ireland. One part is Northern Ireland, which is the UK, and one part is the Republic of Ireland. And actually, people cross from one side to the other who are migrants or asylum seekers, they're made illegal. So we're also playing this out. The conversation starts with a blog site, which is represented here. And each person is just picturing very simple questions. I like the idea of kind of sensorial elements that raise questions around memory and history. For example, is there a smell that reminds you of home? Is there a sound that reminds you of home? So a narrative starts to begin amongst these 12 people. It's very free-ranging, and over a period of about 3 months, this conversation continues. What's actually happening here is the preparation for a film narrative, script. The script is being enacted through this dialogue. And later, everybody knows how this is going to play out, and later the whole group is then invited to a dinner. Somebody mentioned a dinner in terms of getting things done in Sri Lanka and conversations. So the conversation is around a dinner table. It's set up as kind of Renaissance painting. And everybody's dressed really elegantly. Everybody's invited to dinner. But it's totally constructed. It's performance in a TV studio. And what's being played out here, and I'll play a clip shortly, is that I'm interested also in the kind of theoretical frames that surround work, and here I'm evoking also Jacques Derrida and his notion of hospitality, which is connected to borders, which is connected to, in this case, Europe, closing down borders, keeping people out. And this idea to be hospitable, one has to give everything away. And Derrida calls this an aporia, an impossibility, to give up everything for the other and to have the ability to control that at the same time. It's an impossibility. But right there in this philosophical discussion, something interesting can happen, I think. What's brought into representation then with this group of people is through voice, through narrative, not my narrative, importantly, not my representation, people representing themselves. And the kind of dialogues that happen very quickly, actually, not through my manipulation, start to evoke questions around hospitality and what home means, and certainly intercultural debates. So the culture that people have brought with them, it becomes manifest in a way. And what's really at stake for me in bringing this into representation, it's also challenging the hegemony of media, of the way the media represents it. So the media would have us believe that every migrant who crosses from sub-Saharan Africa is illiterate, unworthy. They start to use biblical terms like flooding into countries. So all this is an arm of the state to disempower the public, to disempower people, to start to think about what's at stake. And this whole piece is set up to dialogue with that. And I think about this in a kind of triangular relationship. So my collaborators are very close. They're like my family now. We've been together for like 10 years, and there isn't time to go into various kind of anecdotes. And And then at the top of that triangle is the audience. So it's a circular relationship. And when this work is installed in it, and this one is in gallery space often, the way people are positioned in front of a monitor, they become part of that. It's a privileged position. So as you peer over the shoulder of the dinner table guests, you are in a privileged position to listen to what's being said by these people. And then after a few minutes you realise actually these people are talking about you. And it's a reflective moment where you have to consider your own position in relationship to the other. I'm going to play a clip now. The other thing that's interesting, again, on prompt, people start quoting Heidegger, Muriel, the Palestinian poets, and there's all these kind of, oppositional, resistant positions related to the way that one considers representations that circulate. I'll play that.
We seem to have similarities and differences in certain areas. In terms of having to know how to respond to questions you have been asked by the Irish, like how long do you intend to be in Ireland and all that. It's a question that gets faced with most often. I think a number of my friends as well, African girls and others, they get to have those questions entering on them very often. Like, how long do you intend being here? Are you enjoying living in Ireland? Sometimes, depending on who is asking the question, you tend to get the vibes that you're not really welcome. And you ask yourself, why are you so much in a hurry to know how long I want to be here? When I'm just coming, you're not giving me welcome, you're already asking me when I'm going. That's how we perceive it as an African, because of difference in cultural ethics. So you would never ask us. You would ask a visitor, when are you going? You normally welcome the person and say, oh, I hope you're okay, you're enjoying yourself. What do I do for you and all that? But when someone asks you, oh, are you enjoying it? Do you want to go? What do you intend to stay here? No, the way it comes out is the way you begin to perceive that you are welcome or you are really not welcome. All in all, we just make jokes about it among us Africans that, well, they shouldn't be in a hurry to send us away because we're already here, especially even if we were interested in going back. The children we have come into Ireland with, to live with, don't seem to have much interest in wanting to move from one country to the other. They're already settled here, enjoying themselves here. They've made friends here, they go to school, they mingle with their friends, attend the parties, go for clubbing, like my boys. They are into football, they'll be playing with the different FA teams, and they're very comfortable.
But in terms of, in certain cases, the media tend to misrepresent immigrant communities here. In newspapers, every day you will see headlines like bogus asylum seekers, influx of refugees, and to make it worse, it creates a sense of insecurity amongst immigrants who contribute immensely to the economy here through the massive workforce that bring along.
We realize that things are not forever. Nothing is always there. And I think we have the structure is rebuild and reestablish our home. And for last month also I was reading this book called Esso Ramala on Maureen, a poet from Pakistan. And he was describing some of these times that they are refugees and they are 20 years outside of their own home, and they don't buy furniture, they don't buy anything because they want to establish a relationship with the place they don't have the idea that they want to go back home. And so that's something that I'm processing now. I'm trying to be at home wherever I am and trying to make home and I don't think I'm lucky enough that I have lots of friends that I can establish relationships that I feel at home with them.
taste, sound, smells, kind of things. Yeah, my mind went to the time I met some others from the north when the battle was going on. The mothers I met in the hospital with their children. I don't know whether it's sick children or I mean, yeah, lifeless children. They were still breathing. But when I talked to those mothers and children, what they wanted was uriku sapadu. That is katadana kana. Can you say spicy food? It's not very spicy food. Huh? Yeah, something which they can really feel, some food. That's what they were missing. So the people who were pro and anti-war, talking so many things, so many words, so many concepts, so many ideologies, jargons, workshops, fights, all sort of things, but they wanted Ripu Sappada. So my poetry book named Ripu Sappada, but I don't know whether anyone understood it. Few, I think. So how we are not ready to understand what people can miss in different situations. Maybe because we are not ready to understand what we miss.
How we are not able to understand what people can miss is maybe a very good title for another session. Perhaps not as a panel discussion. Can I just check again if there are any questions? If not, I'd like to just ask the panelists each to make any comment they like in response to this session. And perhaps if it's, we have one at the back. Hold on.
This works?
Yeah.
It's a small question, and it's an observation as well. I just want to go back to the word resistance and also invoke at the same time the use of the word politics that you've been mentioning in different ways. And really with the observation, I've been thinking about the word resistance when you think about the history of art in general. It's been a word that has been used from almost the very beginning. I'm just going to dip into one time when it was called Refusé, and there was a Salon de Refusé, which was an exhibition that came about because artists did not want to show within a certain ideological grouping of works which was regarded as the Academy and the Salon. And from that moment onwards, you do begin to get definitions of the avant-garde, which defined itself as a break with the past, a break with tradition, a break with ideology. The avant-garde has come into its own to be seen as something that was specific to a historical moment, but also comes to define successive reactions, if you like, by artists to a status quo. So my question to the panel is, are you not just another avant-garde? Or are you something different? And if so, in your work, what is different about the art that you're making? And why I'm asking is because I do have always the question circling in my mind that artists who talk about resistance and politics in their work don't necessarily make work that I think there's or rather phrase it this way, work that is described in this way, I think is work that also takes on a particular moral stance that seems to as well reject other practices. And there are many artists who are not on this panel who would say their work is not about resistance, is not about politics, because they don't want to name it as such. And that also calls into the same conversation in aesthetics, I noticed we talked about the ethics, but there is a whole discussion about aesthetics. And I think, without going on too long, a work that has a politics or a resistance at its core lacks, and this is a provocation, an aesthetic. Which I think I just want to ask you all about how you all feel about that, and whether you see it as something in your own work.
We could talk about this for a very long time. I mean, I recognise I'm very familiar about history. I suppose my reference point would probably be fluxes and situations in relation to that, position in society where one decides to create particular narratives. But coming back to the question of the avant-garde, I think I'm most interested in contemporary art in relation to dialogical and relational aesthetics. But for me, when we read Buryard's term of relational aesthetics, it's too safe. It's too much about what he calls a microtopia, this utopian kind of moments that artists create, but it's already known. We're in a gallery space, we're in this kind of middle class situation, and nothing is really challenged. So equally, Graham Pester talks about the idea of the avant-garde as something that's kind of about mystique. Of course, it's about renewal, it's about challenging the status quo, but it can also be about creating distance, creating a mystique around the artwork itself. I think my challenge, or what I'm interested in, is acknowledging that history and knowing that history, but also moving beyond that history. So part of my position as an artist is to think about something peripheral, like these kind of practices, but to start to drive them through the center. So this kind of work becomes central to an emerging contemporary art. That's just a few kind of comments on reaction to what you said, but I think we're talking about writing a thesis here in relation to your observations. I think I'll pass it on in fairness because of time.
You bring up an interesting point about the artist's position, actually. And I think my way to responding to it is also talk about the artist's position. And there are different points. We may not call ourselves political, nor do we set out, or sometimes we set out consciously or subconsciously to resist. But just a thought that occurred to me is possibly a Bromwell's work. And in 1974, when she did Rhythm Zero, she sat there in front of an audience with a whole array of all sorts of instruments of pain or pleasure, as she titled it. So there were knives, there were feather dusters, there were roses, there were handcuffs, there was a gun with a single bullet in it. And she invited the audience to do that. She told the audience that she would sit there for 6 hours without doing anything, and she invited the audience to do whatever to her. Not realizing, I think, what she opened up, because she talks of the scars and the bruises that she still has on her body to this day. But for her, at that point, that provocation somehow, as an act of resistance, was possibly at its most vocal when she tested those boundaries of just humanity and the lengths to which we could go to. Whether it was somebody who came and cut her body, or somebody who placed a photograph from her childhood on her shoulder blade, or someone who held the gun to her head for the longest of time, or someone who just stood really close to her and just kept breathing. And then in 2010, she did another piece at the Museum of Modern Art in New York that was titled The Artist is Present. And all she did was sit across the table and look into the eyes of her audience, and her audience viewed for minutes and hours and days, just to stare into the eyes of the artist. And it's interesting that position changes, and the way in which you incite changes, and the way in which you structure space changes, and the way in which we invoke that notion of resistance also changes, that there is a way in which sometimes you just invite someone to come and look into your eyes. And even there is a sense of resistance, but there is also an aesthetic that has evolved from the 1970s to the 2000s. Sorry, you're very short. Okay, sorry. And I think it is a massive question, and it is a question that even I asked of myself when I played Lakshmi for my other history in a theatre context. It wasn't my script, it was James' script. It wasn't the character of my design, it was something that someone else wrote. And consistently I felt wrong in a naturalist aesthetic. And yet the naturalist aesthetic was the right, quote-unquote, aesthetic for that moment. So I think we think about aesthetics and the way in which form allows for a particular kind of politics to be present without necessarily always calling ourselves political artists. So it's a whole range of thoughts that just got evoked by the question, I think.
I don't have to say much, but with my book I'm not actually going much with words. I think what I want is to bring love and compassion back to the humankind.
Small ambitions.
Just maybe another comment on that. I'm also thinking about both the aesthetic is political. It's a branch of philosophy. We can think about Ranzia's book, Politics and Aesthetics, which unpacks this whole notion that aesthetics somehow stands alone. There's a whole debate around this kind of question. Equally, we can think about aesthetics and beauty. The question is raised, can beauty, can something be that's beautifully aesthetic, be a call to arms?
That would be a nice note to end on, but do we have any other questions?
I think art is basically conveyance of feeling. You're conveying a feeling. And so the feeling could be beautiful, peaceful, or you could be trying to communicate. And this is a subset. It's not, you can't think of art in your head. It has to come from there. What the mind is looking for. It has to be your passion. So I'm challenging that with.
We need a response here.
I agree with you. The first position is actually, as an artist, is to be intuitive. Everything else is secondary, so the idea of theorizing, the idea of thinking through, comes after the action of being immersed in the world, of thinking of creative act. So it's not that there's something, you start with something very academic and then try to make a piece of work about that. No, it's totally the other way around. You're living through your dreams. I personally read literature, I read poetry, and that's where and the world that I live in, that's where the ideas come from. So I think, to be fair, this context is about analysing something that is already made. It's significantly different, perhaps, from being an art historian, where you start from an academic point of view. It's about, I think, about another kind of position where one thinks as an artist through that work, and not trying to frame a particular abstract or academic theory outside of that. That's important.
It's increasingly time for us to finish talking and go back to work. But perhaps I could ask each of the panelists if there's any final comment they'd like to make. Starting with Ronnie.
I just have to say.
So we're done here. Thank you very much for coming.